The Dr. Oba Tashaka Show. Free your mind, and the rest will follow. A show for all who are on the journey to discover the truths about their identity, history, culture, politics, spirituality, and family relationships. This is a show for the Black Freedom Movement and the Black Power generation and the hip-hop generation, including Black Lives Matter and associate activists, all of whom are seeking change. Dr. Oba Tashaka and his guests are dropping knowledge and insight from his successful organizing, research, writings, and innovative thoughts, the best of which have piped into God's mind to lift you up higher and higher. To the bosses, OGs, rappers, influencers, and those looking to evolve from the constraints of misinformation and miseducation to build a foundation for personal growth, love, and mental freedom. Check out the wisdom of the OR. Yeah, that's the original revolutionary, Oba T, who inspired 1 million black men with his rousing speech at the Million Man March, and who continues to fight, write, and speak the truth. Dr. Oba Tashaka is one of the deepest deep thinkers in the world today. A quote by Dr. Asa Hilliard. Dr. Oba Tashaka, then Bill Bradley, was the best leader organizer in the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE. An endorsement from Dr. George Wiley, Associate Director of National CORE and the best organizer blacks produced in the 1970s as the organizer of the National Welfare Rights Organization. The Dr. Oba Tashaka Show. Free your mind, and the rest will follow.
Good morning. This is Oba Tashaka. This is the Dr. Oba Tashaka Show. How's everybody doing? Hope y'all doing fine. I see Sister Robin and Brother Gawa on. Symptomatic of the dedication of these two viewers. Greetings. If you note, there's been another improvement to the show. This time we've added a playlist, and that enables you to see different shows that have been put into a series and different topics in a certain order. But YouTube can only put so many of these shows. I think that's something like 98 into a playlist. Hello, Robin. Right on. So this is a new addition so that people, especially who are new to the show and haven't watched all the shows, and there are about 98 of them now, can come in to the site and then pick some categories in addition to the current show that is being shown at the time. So the way, for people who don't know this, the way playlist works is that when you go into the show, the first thing you're going to see is a playlist. And what you do is click on underneath the picture that says playlist, and that click on will give you a sequence of shows that will follow under that particular topic. And so we have different topics like Malcolm X, Afrocentric thought, revitalizing Black communities, Black Power, and other topics on the first level. And then on the next level that comes below the first, we have a category that's called African History. And under this category is listed the 4 shows that we've completed on the Trois and the Superlative Light. And then below that line, a third line below, is a list of some of the shows on the Anu, the founders of Kemet. And that was put in there, all of that, to focus on some central shows that people can get. So this is a feature that is important to have, and so we've got it now. So use it and take advantage of it. For a while, this show has not been linked to Facebook. There was some issues, and those have been solved. And so we're relinked with our Facebook family that's growing. And I don't want Facebook friends to think we had forgot about them. We haven't forgot about you. It was just some issues that came up. And so I'll be rehooking up with Facebook friends. All the Facebook friends have received a notice for this show, and there'll be other follow-throughs that we'll be doing for Facebook friends. On the issue of the news, the only thing I wanted to comment on was the fact that a lot of news has been up on the issue of police violence, and every day or so you're getting a report of some killing or some violence practiced by the police against Black people. And you've seen the Democratic Party back off of any support for defunding police and stuff like that at the national level. And Biden had always indicated that he didn't support that, but you're seeing it on other levels. And now that in some areas a little violence has spiked going up, in some communities that's being used as an excuse to make sure that there are no cutbacks on funding for the police. And with the election of the new mayor in New York, he came in as an ex-policeman, and so he tried to bridge the activist community and the conservative community. And so he's also voiced his support for increased police spending. But what isn't obvious that people should understand is the issue of ending police violence or cutting back on it and defunding police and putting money into other areas is being fought largely on the local level. And on the local level, a lot of local communities have made some changes because of the pressure coming from local movements. And so this is something to be mindful of, because it would appear from what you're getting from the national media that there's no motion on the issue of police violence. And that isn't the case. And in the case of Black Lives Matter, their chapters have been working in different areas of the country, and there are a number of networks and groups that have been working on this for a long period of time. So it's important to be aware of that, and in your community, you should be involved in efforts to see that money is being shifted away from police budgets into social programs, into housing, into jobs, into issues that benefit the Black community. And one reason why the media, the national media, is not covering this is because it's corporate owned. And the corporations have bought into neoliberalism, which means that put everything in the pocket of the rich and put as little as possible into the hands of the people and into the pockets of the people. And with the increased movements around unionization, you're seeing that a lot of people are not falling for this. And so this is an important thing to keep note of, and in your communities, take part in these struggles to ideally end police violence. But as long as you have this system, they're going to be there. The question is, can you mitigate it, reduce it? And in the end, as we're creating just societies, there should be no need for police or jails, you know. But for that to happen, people have to have some justice, not just iced. And a lot of people are getting iced. And when you get iced, you do crazy things, you know. So that's a little news item. For the last 4 shows, we've had a series on God, the superlative light, which kicked this off. And those 4 shows made a connection between the superlative light of God and then that light that was endowed in and embedded in the Twa, also known as Anu or Kun people. And that was, all of them had that connecting link of spirit to show that spirit was really the basis for the ability of the Twa to pass on civilization. And it explained why a people who are the first people on the planet came in highly developed. Because normally with Europeans and others, and even Africans who come after the Twa, they need to be brought to the civil state, as we showed with the show on how the Twa civilized the Bantu people. And some people were wondering about that, and I had to remind them that's what the Bantu people said. So don't think this is some propaganda. But the Twa come in fully civilized, highly empowered, innovating all the major features of civilization while deciding not to live in cities and stuff until they made the move to build Kemet under the Anu, which we covered in a previous series. So that's the connecting link of those 4 shows. And that's a connecting link to this one. I didn't know whether there would be a 5th show because I kind of do this like jazz. So I was thinking, well, what's going to be the next show? And then I woke up Tuesday morning and it was clear. The next show, and this will conclude this series, though it doesn't finish the topic because we're just hitting the top of this. So that's the reason why the title and topic for this show is God's Superlative Light in Egyptian and African American Civilization. So that's what we're going to be covering today. The light, the superlative light that comes from God, that was able to shine through the Twa, being the first humans on the planet, how they then were able to take that light and shine it on Africa and shine it on the world. So that's the basis for this topic today. And I thought it would be valuable to bring in both African civilization, in this case, Kemet, and African American. And greetings to Worley Smith and Lisa Grayson. Glad to have you on the show. And Stephen McKenzie, who's just come in. Again, I hope you get this. This is a new spin on history. We've had pioneers in the field who have African and African American pioneers who have done research on the Twa, but connecting them up to the history of Africa and the history of the world, there's been a failure to do that because, as before I noted, they've been reduced to the field of anthropology. And then also kind of following the hominids and stuff, the beings like Lucy, that over 1 million years old, part human, part animal. And so they've been kind of reduced to that level. And one of the reasons is when you put people outside of history, then you don't bother to really study their culture and their civilizational contributions. And so the point made in the last shows was that they made the highest contributions to civilization, not only as civil people, but in the technical realms of medicine, astrophysics, physics, botany, and a host of other areas, ethics, but resting it on the civil basis, that is, on the basis of being a civil and kind people, which generally is excluded from the definition of civilization because the people who are making it know it would leave them out. You understand? It would leave them out. And that's why Western historians say, well, civilization is an interesting idea, meaning for them. But since they treat all history and civilization as Western and then put everyone else in as a footnote, when they're the last people on the block to engage in history, the last ones, that in terms of continents, the Twa moved first into Asia, and then Europe, which is a part of Asia, later. And then we really hear of them 2,000 years ago. And we don't hear them bringing on civil behavior. So if you put civil as a definition, the prerequisite for defining civilization, then it leaves out anyone that's practicing savagery as their primary mode of activity. And if they reduce civilization to material things, like in this era, skyscrapers, or in other eras, whatever structures they're able to create, whatever weapons of destruction they're able to create and stuff like that, then you have kind of a limited, if not false, definition of civilization. So in my book, The Integration Trap Generation Gap Caused by a Choice Between Two Cultures, I make the point that instead of treating the Twa as part of prehistory, which technically, as I pointed out before, means people before writing, and a lot of European people or Aryans got written into history even though they were only oral, at least left an oral imprint. Their first philosopher, Hesiod, the foundational philosopher of Aryan thought, at least Western Aryan thought, was illiterate, Now, we call it the oral tradition in Africa, but since they tend to put this down, I'm going to put it on them. That's illiterate. And he couldn't, read or write. He was a poet and he was a sheep herder. But his thoughts are foundational to Aryan thought. They don't get written out of history. Of course, he's an embarrassment. I'm not going into why here, but He's generally not included under the humanities in university curriculums, and definitely not in the realm of philosophy. He's excluded usually because he's kind of not systematic. He's all over the place, but he's fundamental. You want to understand the Aryan, you better understand Hesiod, Hesiod. His works, Theogony and Works and Days. And these are works that were oral, put into writing. So someone who was all over the place and was oral, illiterate, gets put into history that is really foundational for philosophy. But the Twa get excluded. So the point I've made, and I make in the integration trap, is that the Twa represent formative history, meaning that they form history, not prehistory. They are at the level of formative civilization. And they are the ones who create civilization. So I think of all people on the planet, they're the most creative because they innovate just about everything when it comes to knowledge, but especially when it comes to humanity. And I just want to really make this point that it is generally agreed by African philosophers, and they're correct on this, that African humanism has never been dependent upon what they call religion, which there is no such thing in traditional Africa. We'll get into that in a minute. By that, though, they mean spirit systems. And that's because Africans didn't need to be told what was right and wrong. They didn't need God to stand up and issue a series of laws so that they could fall in line to their law. All they had to do was go inside themselves, and we're going to talk about this process in a minute. And from there, they knew right from wrong, which we're going to focus on today. So African humanism has not rested on any need for Africans to be told by God through laws what to do. You are born with that knowledge. Now, as some people make the point to me, particularly mothers, that point is reinforced by mothers and fathers and by society, and that's true. But bad behavior in terms of bad treatment of children can throw people off this course. And that happens. We know that. And then some who are treated poorly, abused, raped, all this stuff that a lot of people go through, particularly women. Some who go through that can transcend it. Others, it brings them down. In either case, you understand it. There's no judgment on that. But Twa humanism is so deep, Twa kindness is so deep that it's deeply embedded in your DNA. It's deeply embedded, and this is a concept that I found from parapsychologists, I've talked about it before, who've gone to the spirit realm, and they have seen what they call cellular memory. It's embedded in your cells, but it's also embedded in your history and in your culture. And so, the tie today is between Kemetic civilization and African American, and the role of spirit in both. You're going to see that two things that are really central in both civilizations, and when I use Kemetic, I'm using it as a paradigm for all African civilizations. And when I use African American, it's also a paradigm for all African diasporan civilizations, the Caribbean, South America. Not saying they're all the same, but saying that in certain respects they are. And in one respect is spirit, number one, and humanism. Those are embedded in us, And it doesn't mean some of us haven't departed from it. I'm not romanticizing this. And some of us have become extremely inhumane. particularly since the post-1968 period, where some terrible things have happened to Black communities, Black families, and Black life. And so we're seeing some monstrous things going on. So I'm not romanticizing this, but spirit and humanism are just central to what it is to being African. And as I said before, we could lose 90% of our humanism and have more than most people have. I'm talking about groups of people, other than Native Americans. They're on the level that our people are on. So the Twa give birth to formative history. And by Twa, I also am referring to Kung or San people, Kung. That's another word for Twa. They come out of South Africa. As I pointed out before, mitochondrial DNA makes it clear they are the oldest of all human beings. We had a brother from South Africa on last week, and when I used the word Twa, he didn't think I was including Kung, but I had also used the word Kung when I talked about the migrations out of Africa into Europe. And those were Kung people. I made that point, but he might not have heard that. So Kung, San, same people. And then Biaka Chwa, and Kung and San people come from the Kalahari Desert in South Africa. And then the Biaka Chwa come from the Congo. And according to mitochondrial DNA, the DNA of the mother, these two are the oldest people, with Kung being clearly the oldest and their language still being spoken. So the Twa or Kung, San, Biaka Twa people give birth to formative history. And, I kind of equate this to the mother in the sense that the role that the Twa play in history is like the role that the mother plays with both the embryo, the child, the adolescent, the adult, those who go through old age. She's the formative influence in the womb and is shaping that being, that entity called the human being in the womb. And her influence is so deep that child, adult, or old person doesn't fully appreciate the depth of influence. And if you have a good mother, then that depth is deeply positive. And if that mother's off for various reasons, then there's probably going to be some real issues that the child, then grown adult and elder, if they reach that point, has to grapple with. But the key point is she is at the foundation of the formation of the human being. The Twa are the mothers and fathers of humanity. And so they are at the formation of humanity, African humanity, Asian, Native American, Aryan, Pacific Islanders, Alaskans, global human beings. And so their influence is going to be deep. So how you ignore this, you ignore it at your own expense when it comes to giving an account of history. So formative history, depending upon your dating, mitochondrial DNA, 144,000 years, give or take 10,000 forward or backward, because that's the error rate, or hominid specimens, bones and stuff that have been found in different parts of Africa that date back 200,000. Some like to even date it back further. And I have no problem. The older it is, the further back we go, that's great for me, But I like mitochondrial DNA because it's the most precise, coming from the mother. It's not lost. And so the mother's people's influence is, because it's formative on humanity and civilization, it's deep. And so it impacts every area of African civilization, Asian, Native American, people of color, and in its early phase, especially Aryan, as they develop into whites out of the Ice Age that we covered last week. So it's in every area, you know, their influence, because humans existed in this state for so long. And one of its most primary, in fact, its most primary influence is in the realm of spirit, its most primary influence. And so today's show examining God's superlative light, which means superlative free of blemish, error, or wrongdoing. God's superlative light in Egyptian and African American civilization. And so it's looking at how the Chwa transmitted the light of civilization over the longest period of human history to subsequent African civilizations, and today focusing on the greatest of all when it comes to the societies that live in cities and, develop complex social and class structures and economic systems and political systems and so forth. Then the greatest achievement in that level of civilization was made by the people of Kemet. And the people that found Kemet are Chwa, Anu. When God gave me the Chwa, I knew later God was giving me even more than what God gave me, the formula for just societies. And I knew, because I like truth and justice. I know, like most of you, all of you, I would assume. And it, to me, is the most important thing. I told my current wife, wonderful lady, I've said this before on the show, there's only one thing I love more than you. Now, every woman likes to hear this. So, of course, this is going to invite the what? The truth. The beautiful truth. Because that's what the truth is. And ultimately, that's God. And then all the manifestations that come from God through the superlative light and other intuitive means of acquiring the truth. So this show is going to examine how God's superlative light served as the primary influence on the two civilizations, Kemet and Afro-America. Now, that second one is new for a lot of you. Oh, we have a civilization? Yeah, you know what I mean? Civilization, as I define it, is based on one, the way you treat others. You got to be civil. And I would say that in this society, the African American has demonstrated high levels of civility. Some of us haven't, but most of us have. And those that haven't, they can at least offer some excuses. They usually come under the category of abuse. But the fact is, most of us have. And I say Native Americans as well. And a lot of people of color have brought theirs in as well. And there are individual whites that manifest this. But as a cultural thing, as a people, we manifest high civilization as a people. And then you want to get into our civilizational achievements? Well, this show ain't going to do all of that. But you want to talk about science, as a civilizational achievement? You want to talk about medicine, as a civilizational achievement? Do you want to talk about all the other technical areas? Do you want to talk about family and family structure and relationships, contrary to popular opinion? I'm just telling you that it qualifies you for the highest rungs of civilization. And then do you want to talk about art? And I'm talking about the art form, not just painting, but the art form. The Euro-American has created no art form in this country. no music, no art, no literature that's indigenous to this country. You hear me? Unless you want to talk about Hollywood or commercials. In fact, Gore Vidal, one of the white's best historians, one I really liked, especially on foreign policy, he said the Euro-American art form is commercials. That's about the only thing that's got anything funny to it when you're watching TV. And you're really wasting your time because it's all designed to get your money. You know what I mean? Ain't nothing else to it. So, I mean, if that's the extent of your art, and that was his way of capping on his own people, capping, putting down. That's my generation's saying, putting down. It was like making a joke out of it. And then people like Oswald Spengler, who's a German historian, wrote Decline of the West, Our Decision, Man of the Techniques. He said of the Aryan, the European, you should give up on art, music, and any kind of high culture. We're just a race of bridge builders, meaning we've got so involved in greed and grasping for power, we're not too good at that other stuff. And let's not even talk about dancing, because if you're bridge builders, you're mechanistically inclined. And so that takes the dance out of you, takes the rhythm out of you. You understand? So shouldn't be an issue. You got a high civilization here. Our problem is we're just independent politically. Free the mind and the rest can follow. And that's going to take a battle too. So my topic is God's superlative light in Egyptian and African American civilization. So this is not just for Kemet, but also what I'm saying about Kemet applies to other parts of Africa. And what I say about Africans in America has application, particularly in this spirit dimension, to other African civilizations, in this case in the diaspora. So the last 4 shows did something that I hadn't done before, and that was to rest the civilizational power of the Twa on their purity. And that's something that they both proclaim and manifest through practice. They call themselves the pure people. And we've talked before about how their conception of God had no negative in it. And that's because as a pure people, they were able to conceive of God because they were on a high level themselves. Not perfect, but nearly so. No war, no oppression of women or children or elders, no slavery, freedom. That's why people lived in this state for so long. So the purity of God's first people gave them the power to emanate creativity because it came from their good character. So as pointed out before, they start off with the highest clairvoyant and telepathic powers known to humanity. It doesn't mean individuals don't still have that, and African cultures have it, and individuals in every culture have it. But we're talking about the order of a culture, of a people. And I'm sure within Twa societies, they had certain people who manifested these qualities at the highest level. But you had many manifesting it at a very high level. And that's because of the purity of character. And that's to this day. As in previous shows, I gave you some examples of today of their clairvoyant powers to this day. This enabled them, this purity of character that was an expression of the light, enabled and inspired them to create a society free of oppression. And it enabled them to draw on the highest mental powers. Here we're talking about higher mind powers that could enable them to innovate so much in civilization. And so it's from the hunter-gatherers that this was bequeathed to Africans who come along later and other humans during the agrarian period, which is also innovated by the Twa, in this case, Twa woman. So as noted in the Anu and the Anu Twa series, as noted, these people, Anu Twa, were the founders of ancient Kemetic civilization, and they called themselves, their term or their name, Anu, meant great ones. Muhammad Ali said, "I'm the greatest," before he had knocked any heavyweight champion out. And so some people, even Black people, said, "Oh, he's got a big mouth, blah, blah, blah." But then he proceeded to knock him out. But not just knock him out with grace, speed. His jab was so fast, you had to put that jab into slow motion to see it. And he could take you out with a jab. So that is really something. And he had the speed of a middleweight because he copied his stuff after Sugar Ray Robinson, who's considered by boxing experts to be the very best boxer. I'm not getting into that argument because I'm no expert on that. But it's interesting that when he knocked out Sonny Liston, Sugar Ray Robinson was there in the weigh-in, and he was there at the victory. And when when Muhammad Ali said, "I'm pretty," and all this, Sugar Ray Robinson was smiling because he was even prettier. And one of his main assistants, that I learned about this when we interviewed Dr. David Imhotep, who was Muhammad Ali's, person who dealt with health. One of his main assistants had been an assistant to Sugar Ray Robinson, and Sugar Ray Robinson advised Muhammad Ali to bring him on. The one who formulated the poem, "Float like a butterfly, sting like a bee, Muhammad Ali." But the greatest thing about Muhammad Ali was his character. And that's his Twa and African legacy, because African people inherited that from the Twa. And I think that's the greatest legacy we received from the civilizations of Africa. Yeah, the pyramids are great, but I think pyramids of character are most important. The ones with noble character, those are the real noble ones. As my wife says, in the Caribbean, they call them poor great. These are everyday Black folks who are materially poor and great in character, great in culture, and great in the way they carry themselves. You hear me? That's the quality of Black folks. So the Anu are the founders of what is incorrectly called pre-dynastic Kemet. I have renamed it. I'm not getting into that now. It's an incorrect term because the dynasties start in ancient Kemet with Asar. So how's that pre-dynastic? Again, you're taking these little people and reducing them to historical insignificance when they create all the elements of the greatest civilization on the planet when it comes to the organized one, because the Twa hunter-gatherer one was the greatest one. It was the innovator of civilization. Those that create formative history. But when you're talking about all the elaborate stuff, including pyramids and all this stuff that you love and you should, you know what I mean? Then, again, who gave birth to that? These little ones, the Anu, who are the greatest creators of all. And so Anu, as I pointed out in a previous show, great ones, they're named after Ani. And that is the name for Asar, Ani. And so they are naming themselves after their first ancestor, who was the founder of the first dynasties in ancient Kemet, not the one starting in 32 or 3300 BC. And he's the one that brought the civilization to his people. And so he, Asar, also called Ani, is playing the same role in civilizing the people in the Nile Valley. I estimate this was around 6500 BC, based on processional cycles. I've talked about this before. And so what he did is do for the people of the Nile Valley what the Twa did for the Bantu people in the discussion that I had on how they civilized the Bantu people in the Niger-Congo area. He did that. And that was, again, an example of how that was done throughout Africa and the world, and we substantiated it later. So Asar is playing that same role with people in the Nile Valley. And this means that while the civilization of ancient Kemet was founded by the Anu and their Twa, that the people he civilized, and these are bigger Africans, because the little ones didn't need to be civilized. So that means that he also had some of these bigger Africans up under them. You know what I mean? So this is the description of Asar's role in ancient Kemet, in bringing civilization to ancient Kemet. According to Anu legend, and I'm quoting from their legend, one of the first acts related to Asar or Ani in his reign was to deliver the Egyptians from their destitute and brutish manner of living. In other words, they were poor and they weren't behaving properly. Huh? Here come the Twa again, bringing you to civilization. Huh? And so it goes on to say, this he did by showing them the fruits of cultivation, by giving them laws and teaching them to honor the gods. Now, Aset is the mother of agriculture, but when it comes to taming grains and stuff like that, the growing of grains, Asar played an important role in that, which is also giving you another clue because of this ancient period. Because when the Twa innovate agriculture, the first societies that are formed by the bigger Africans who evolve out of them under slightly different climatic conditions, these societies are agricultural, and the earliest ones that appear, both men and women played a role in agriculture. Now, in most African societies following that, the larger they get, it's the women who are the primary agriculturalists, except for exceptions, like among the Yoruba. Exceptions always prove the rule. You know, we always got to be making exceptions, you know, Black folks. So the Yoruba, the man is the farmer. The woman handles the marketplace, except she doesn't get to sell his goods. He sells his, she sells hers. The man has to put the woman in business, by the way. But in most African societies, it is the woman who's the agriculturalist. And in many, the men do the heavier agricultural work and the women do the lighter. But since colonialism, a lot of weight has been put on the African woman, too much weight. And you got some lazy behavior coming from some African men with the coming of colonialism, because it supports patriarchy over the balanced family systems that Africans had. So Asar, Ani, is playing the role of civilizing these bigger Africans in ancient Kemet. And he's taking them out of brutish behavior, meaning uncivilized behavior, and is putting them on the path to not being poor by showing them how to make a living through agriculture. They also say that this he did, bringing civilization to his people, by showing them the fruits of cultivation, by giving them laws and teaching them to honor the gods. Now, by laws doesn't mean what you think. And when we get into this next part, you'll see. But it's a certain order, just as the Chua did with the Bantu people, teaching them against incest and other kinds of wrongdoing. So Asar is teaching morality. And then they say, and there's some indication that this is true, he then traveled to other parts of the earth, civilizing people without the use of arms, no armies. And he won most of the people over by his kindness, by his charm, and by his singing and musical abilities. He was a soul brother. You hear me? Huh? You know? So this is how the Twa did their thing. As I pointed out in the last show, dealing with their presence in Asia, Europe, and America, didn't go into the Pacific or Alaska. No armies. They're the first people to occupy these areas, Asia and America and whatnot, Europe. But when the other people come in, they're playing the role of civilizers. They are not bringing in force and violence, though they have proven their ability to defend themselves. And I pointed out last week, had victories on the British Isles, running Britain, over a third of Britain for a substantial period of time. But that was in a war brought to them. It was not one they started. So one of the areas in which Asar is said to have brought civilization was to India. And again, through persuasion. So Asar plays the same role in Kemet that the Chua and Kung people play throughout Africa and throughout the world as first ancestor. He's the first ancestor of the Kemetic people, and the Chua throughout Africa as hunter-gatherers, and Asia and other parts of the world. They're the first ancestors of Africans and of humanity. And their ancestral power, as I pointed out in the series on ancestral power, comes from the power of the ancestors to beam in the light, to draw on the light of wisdom. And this is what Asar brought. And Asar, as we know, is the symbol of regeneration, life, death, and rebirth. And of course, there's a lot of proof that the whole theology around Jesus and stuff, in part, it's drawn from the Asar myths. Gerald Massey, Historical Jesus, Mythical Christ, is a exposition on that. So Kemetic civilization was then centered around spirit and eternal life, and it was centered around truth and justice, or Maat. This was like the foundation. Now, as pointed out previously, the Chwar Kung or San people are the authors of Masuri. I pointed this out last week and have before, Massouri, Masuri. It's an older word than Ma'at, but you have Ma in it, and it had the same meaning, being upright, straight, and true, and righteous. And this gives birth to the idea of Ma'at. Now, for the Chwa, Anu, or Kung people, this is an expression of practice. That's what they are. They're upright people. They're truthful people, kind and just people. So this isn't some theory they pass on to Africa, the rest of Africa. This is a practice, and it becomes a cardinal principle of thought, of deep thought, the deepest thought that Kemet produces, the foundation of their philosophy or their deep thought. So, in examining how the superlative light of God was passed from Twa hunter-gatherers and Anu Twa dynastic Kemetic civilization, it's important to see that Maat is like central as a concept, and it is an expression of spirit. It's a force in nature, and it is what characterizes the ethos of Kemet, meaning their way of being. Some people tell me they don't think ethos is very important. It's very important because it's how people carry themselves. And each people have their own distinct ethos. Now, what I'd say about all African people is Ma'at is central to all African people. But for Kemetic civilization, it's like its foundation in terms of its expression of spirit. It is like at the foundation of the expression of spirit. All African people place a high value on truth, justice, and righteousness. All. African Americans, Africans in the Caribbean, Africans on the continent, Africans in Europe, Africans in Asia, Africans wherever they are. That's central. But the Kemetic civilization, that was like their foundation. And in fact, one of the symbols for Ma'at is a straight slab, meaning something you stand on, like the foundation of a building. So this is key. And I'm making this point also because we have our ethos, and we'll get into that when we talk about African American or New African civilization. Now, there are many ways to approach Ma'at, and for this one, I want to approach it in a way that we often haven't before, and I want to stress its role as spiritual or spirit nourishment. And there is no word in any African language for spiritual. I use it because that's how people recognize what I'm talking about. But Africans, they meant spirit. This is a practice, and this is an entity or a being, not just a theory or a category. So in Kemetic systems and in Kemetic civilization, Ma'at is central, and it serves as the spirit food that nourished the people of the Kemetic civilization. And of course, spirit is the top principle in all African and African American civilizations. Spirit is the topmost principle because God is. You understand? You gonna get any argument on this one here? In fact, it's such a prevailing principle that the great philosopher Kwame Gyeke, who comes out of Ghana, and he's a great philosopher. I read his books, it's outstanding. He said in ancient Africa, there were no atheists. Now, it is almost impossible to say everything is one way. And when you're able to say that, you are stating something that is just fundamental. Not a single atheist, not a single person that questioned the existence of God. Very different from the Aryan civilization. And by the way, I don't think that their being able to profess a belief in God is going to save them, because some of the most serious right-wingers and slave masters profess a belief in God and behave just the opposite, you know? So that's just a comment. But for us, this prevailing sense of spirit everywhere, in everything, was central, and manifesting it at the foundational level in the form of Ma'at. serving as the foundation for society. So I think the best way in approaching Ma'at is not to deal with the litany, harmony, truth, balance, justice, right order, some things that have been added that I won't go into. But I think its essence is reduced to 4 words: speak truth, do truth. Speak truth, do truth. So what's very important to note is that Ma'at is treated as the spirit nourishment of God. When God arises from the primeval noon, which is a watery mass, it's not water, but it's like water, God ingests Ma'at, meaning truth and justice is internal to God's being. That's the real meaning. The other is a symbol. This is the essence. So you need no laws, particularly to put checks on God. God is the ultimate manifestation of truth and the ultimate source of truth. So Ma'at is food and nourishment, means that this is the spirit stuff that sustains God. And therefore, it is the spirit stuff that sustains humanity. And it regulates other life forms. You know? So in ancient Kemet, and Kemet in general, the way in which you can be nourished by Ma'at, fed by Ma'at, so that you can speak truth and do truth, is through opening your heart to Ma'at. Now, in the series on God within, I went into the examples of how this was manifested through the various powers that we have, one of which is the heart mind. And so when you're opening your heart up, this is one of the domains of spirit that you're opening yourself up to, heart mind, which is the seat of emotion and reason in the higher mind. And so it's through the heart. And that's where you generally speak of manifesting kindness. It's also where you usually speak of manifesting intuition, gut feelings, and things like that. Or I feel you, that's your heart. Or love, that's expressed through the heart. This is heart mind. And so opening the heart up, that's also where God sits. It's opening yourself up to God. So since the essence of Ma'at is truth, living Ma'at is the way in which human beings become open to Ma'at, or the truth, living it. This is key. So the mantra in ancient Africa was not just Kemet, was to know something, you have to be it. To know the truth, you have to be the truth. I've referred to this a lot. The book I'm writing on teaching or pedagogy or Seba, it rests on this. So in Western ways of knowing is learned through remembering facts and repeating them. And this is what their pedagogy or system of instruction is based on. But in the new African and in the African systems, knowing arises through experience, the experience of being the truth. This is the key thing. In the West, you can talk truth all you want and walk it any way you want. And that's called speaking with a forked tongue. That is how Native Americans described it. And so you could get fooled with that if you're not careful, because someone said something, and because you may come from a culture where your word means something, then you expect it to mean something for people coming out of another culture. And as I pointed out before, Aryan culture is teleological, meaning it's use-based. What is good is what works for you. So when somebody says this is good, it means that if they enslave you, that's good for them and bad for you. But as far as they're concerned, that's good. That's the meaning of good in Western thought. Now, since you got into the realm of Christianity, and remember, Christianity is not a Western religion. It comes from the Hebrews. They're Semites. They're not, even though many of them now may look like Europeans, whatever, they were not Aryans. Nomadic, but not Aryans, you know? So they have taken on an alien religion and then tried to turn it into some use for them. And so then the moralizing comes from there. And if you take it serious, then they're in trouble. The meek shall inherit the earth, for example, if you take it serious. But I want to see where in Western history has Western man given up the earth to the meek. They've taken the earth. And it may not be that they're just meek. It just may mean that they didn't have the techniques, the gunpowder and other kinds of power to stop that takeover. It wasn't that they were giving their land up or something, but they may have been overpowered. So, when you're talking about these notions, then understand that when Africans are talking about knowing the truth is being the truth, then they're talking about a total knowing, a knowing of the mind, of the body, and particularly the spirit, a total knowing. And that's the African way. And it's the way of some other people. Confucius, who comes out of a civilization founded by Africans. His best student was not the one who could extemporize on all of his teachings. He was the silent one who practiced those teachings, And so the early Chinese had a value for this as well, that it's in the practice that we know something, And so it is in the being that we know the truth because we're living it, we're manifesting it. And this goes back to the different ways in which Africans and Aryans approach philosophy. Aryans, like Socrates, would say, a philosopher is a lover of wisdom. But an African would say, a philosopher is one who's wise. They be that. Yeah, they love it too, but they be that. That's the key thing. You can love wisdom and be a fool. Of course, most people who love wisdom wouldn't be a fool, but it doesn't mean that you're wise, though you've got a good chance, but you're going to have to manifest it through your speech and your actions and in other ways. So the highest dimension of knowing the truth comes through insight. Experience is first, and you have to be it to know it. But to go to the highest realms of truth, this requires insight, often cultivated through wisdom gained through experience. But not everyone who has wisdom gained through experience gets to this higher realm of insight, and we'll see why in a minute. As I pointed out before, the highest realms of truth are the realms where innovators uncover, not create, uncover or discover truths of the cosmos that have always been there, but not seen before, not uncovered before, hidden. Truths of the cosmos, truths of nature. the fact that the Chwa or Anu come into the world with this pure character and these higher clairvoyant telepathic powers, higher mind powers, means that they were piping in to this source from the beginning. And therefore, they were uncovering cosmic truths all over the place for their own benefit and for the benefit of humanity. And this enabled them to uncover the truths of astrophysics, physics, botany, and others, medical science, and many other things, moral systems, which they're born with a knowledge of. So insights reveal the higher truths of the cosmos, such as the theory of relativity. And I've gone into this before, the periodic table in organic chemistry and other things, including John Coltrane's droning sound and George Washington Carver's great insights. So that is what comes from insight. And as I pointed out, having experienced this, and some of you have, the insights that come from this higher realm reveal themselves in such a way that there are whole truths of a part. Or as I've said before, in anything is everything. A part contains a microcosm of the macrocosm of the whole. Something that the logical mind is incapable of doing because it sees in parts. It might get some parts right, but to connect complex wholes, it's virtually impossible. And that's why you see, say, in quantum physics, Einstein innovating quantum physics, theory of relativity, because it came through a dream that connected things. And because he had done the hard work of quantum physics, he could translate and interpret that, you know. And that was certainly true of George Washington Carver in spades. You know what I mean? He came up with so much, you can't even count it, as I pointed out before. So God is the source of these insights. Those who get them, and it's only 2% in any field that get them, they are the ones who God has blessed with the insights. They have to have the foundation. They have had to do the work. A whole lot of people do the work that don't get the insights and don't make the innovations. And so the key to acquiring insight or intuitive insight, which is extremely rare, the key to that is through hard work and discipline, thinking God's thoughts, a term that George Washington Carver often used. So in Kemet, in Africa, and generally many of the people who are able to get these insights, many of them are humble people. Because generally you got to be humble to be open to God's thoughts and God's mind. And that's, again, through thinking God's thoughts and through knowing the systems that you're inquiring about. So in ancient Kemet throughout Africa, the one who was open to God's thoughts was the humble, usually in private, often, in private, I don't mean by himself, but in family settings and in other settings, and often even in community settings, is the one who is often silent and is often a good listener. This is the person who spends a lot of time conversing with themselves, examining things, undergoing self-examination. So this involves internal self-communication and internal self-cultivation, working on yourself, working on pulling out the weeds of your character, which I've talked about before. In Africa, generally, meditation wasn't the way. That was more the Eastern way. A lot of Africans are using that now, and it's a good way. But the main African way was through communing with yourself. And then they had disciplined systems for doing this. And so in Kemet, the ideal person was the usually silent, introspective, self-mastered person called Jeremiah in the Bambara Ma. I pointed this out before, but what I'm pointing out here is how these insights are acquired. And generally, when they are acquired, you will find those who have been privileged to receive God's light and some breakthrough. They're very humble because they know that the truths have come from the minds of God. They know that. And in the West, they may say, well, it came through a dream or came through an intuition. In Africa, they would say that, but they would also say that they came from God. We know the source. And George Washington Carver knew the source. He would always say he was thinking God's thoughts. He was going into the laboratory to do creative science to bring down God's thoughts. And he always did that alone early in the morning when God's vibrations are the strongest, or in the forest communicating with plants, because he also got it through dreams. He got it through communicating with animate and inanimate, organic, mute, as well as four-legged and whatnot creatures, birds and everything else. He was their friend, and they knew it. You know, this was a different kind of science, what I call spirit science, a science of healing, whereas Western science is empirical science, a science of observation. And there's nothing wrong with observation. Nothing wrong. I mean, you should observe things and see how they behave. But Western science, as I pointed out before, is observation for domination and control. And it's exterior, it's external. There's no communication with what's observed. But in the case of a George Washington Carver or Kemet or throughout Africa, you're not just out there observing so that you can know things, but you're communing with nature to be taught things. And then you're going back and helping to heal nature. This is spirit science. This is what's needed to save the planet. So, and I would say George Washington Carver was Jeremiah, without question. Jeremiah. You hear me? One beautiful human being. Cared nothing about money, but about people. First, his people. When he got a blank check from Henry Ford, put any amount in, he could have put $1 billion, he said. He was making only $1,000 a year from Tuskegee. Booker T. Washington had been dead for a number of years. He said, Booker T. asked me to come here, and I'm going to stay here longer. He was dead. But he said the main reason he didn't go work for Henry Ford, he said, my people would not get credit for this. He wasn't looking for the credit. He wanted his people to be able to say, this black man did this. And as I pointed out before, when George Washington Carver would get into his wagon to bring teachings on agriculture to poor black farmers, they would say this: when Professor Carver comes, God has come. And these are people who never called any human being that walked the planet Earth God, and he was too humble to ever think he was or to say it. You hear me? But that was the nature of it. And he was able to commune with God all the time create so many things because he was wide open. He didn't just have some moments of humility. It was a life of humility and service. In fact, his little $1,000 paychecks would often just stack up. And then when he put them in the bank, he was giving the money away to people. You hear me? So this is the way insights are achieved. So Ma'at is an invisible force or spirit of great delicacy, like God, delicate, like Mother Nature, like the cosmos. This rough treatment that Mother Nature has received is throwing Mother Nature, the cosmos, particularly Mother Nature, out of balance. And the corporations don't care. And the media that's projecting it, since they're getting their payroll from them, they're not challenging it. And the politicians who are being paid by them are only dealing with surface stuff. Biden comes in talking about the environment, and now he's increasing fossil fuel consumption using various justifications, none of which are valid. Because they have the view that a lot of corporations have. There's a saying that corporation heads have. I forget the exact way it's said, but it's said when they're making some dirty decisions that hurt the planet, they say, remember, we won't be here. Meaning, we're going to cash out with our $200 million bailout package, and we won't be here to suffer the consequences. And they also mean we won't be alive because we don't really care what happens 50 years from now, even though it's their grandchildren and their children that'll have to suffer that. They don't care, because material things, dead presidents mean more than anything else. So Ma'at is the truth that's very delicate, very, very delicate. It resides within God. It serves as the rudder of heaven and the beam of earth. That's my favorite description of Ma'at. The rudder, that part of the ship that gives it direction. And the old saying, what goes around comes around, Now, a lot of us would question that. Given how much mess the Aryan has done on the planet, when is the come around time going to happen? You know what I mean? But I do know it's true because there is payback. For wrong, there's going to be payback. And so it is that force that governs the direction of the cosmos. It is the force that is the center of heaven because God is its center. And on earth, it's the guide for human conduct, human speech, human thought, human morality, politics, economics, family life, every domain of life. So if you want to talk about ultimate spirit, it's Ma'at, and it's deep. And it's so profound that no one can fully explain it, but we know enough about it to live in harmony with it. And I think the most important thing that we can say about any person is they're a good person. That's the most important thing. You know what I mean? In looking for a mate, first thing I looked for was good character, and then intelligence, and then strength, and a whole lot of other things. And I had a laundry list so long, somebody said, you ain't never going to find anybody like that. Well, guess what? I did. Huh? I mean, as you think, so you are. Remember that definition of power? Your thoughts determine who you are, and your highest thoughts uncover the truths of the cosmos for the benefit of humanity. I mean, that's basically it. And what are the truths? It's Ma'at, baby. Ma'at, So a central gift of the Twa to Africa to Kemet is that every dimension of Kemetic life was spirit-based, with the overriding aim of Ma'at. an ideal that they didn't always achieve. So I'm not romanticizing Kemet. I'm not romanticizing. They had their oppressive periods, you understand? But the ideal was the achievement of justice. And when disorder occurred, the restoration of order was associated with just order. So the teachings of Ptahhotep, for example, where he's criticizing the rich who have oppressed him and other Kemetic people. The pharaoh allows those teachings to be taught because some of these pharaohs had been very oppressive and these high officials. And so it was the teaching of do right. And so that was a corrective against the wrongdoing that had occurred before. And so with ancient Kemet, just societies or the restoration to justice was described as septepi, going back to the first occasion, because the first occasion was the period of justice, the period of truth. Whereas in the Western world, it's just tearing down what was there and ideally replacing it with something better. But since there's no process for getting people to be the truth, to think the truth, then the leaders of these so-called revolutions behave pretty much the same way as the people they replaced. And since there's no questioning of the social order, the family and stuff, then they are repeating oppression, as happened in Russia, to an extent in China. They weren't as brutal as Stalin was. Mao wasn't, but he had his own problems too. In looking at the role of spirit in Kemetic civilization, it's to understand that just as we're in a material civilization where the dollar and power drive everything, even though there'll be the pretense of justice and truth, in Kemetic and in ancient African and traditional African civilization, the driving force was spirit aligned with truth, or at least the attempt to achieve it. And among the Chua, they were both aligned, the walk and the talk. So to understand this, you got to make a distinction between spirit and religion. And this is extremely important because we often confuse, if we're talking spirit, we'll call it spiritual. And then by that, we mean religion. And then we're into a whole different ball of wax. So I previously noted that in Kemetic and in African languages, there's no word for religion. No word. There's no word for spiritual either, because spiritual is a theory. Spirit is a reality. So the word religion derives from a Latin word, religio, R-E-L-I-G-I-O, R-E-L-I-G-I-O, that grew out of syncretism, or the attempt. Syncretism is combining different things. The attempt to combine Roman beliefs with Christianity. Roman beliefs about God and the afterlife and spirits, because the whites who come out of the Ice Age, they are in their beginning spirit people, and it's with Christianity that they begin to move away from that. So that's the meaning of religio. Combine those beliefs about God, the afterlife, spirituality, with Christianity. That's religio. Now, obviously, the Kemites or the Egyptians wouldn't, or other Africans, would not have this definition because their society precedes Christianity and then Islam and Judaism, Islam coming last and Judaism being the root, and then Christianity. These three religions, they are new on the block compared to African spirit systems and other spirit systems in the world. So, of course, they wouldn't use the term religion to begin with, but there are other reasons. And that is because their systems are spirit-based. And so if you're going to draw the distinction between spirit practice and religion or religio, then what characterizes Judaism, Christianity, and Islam is they're all religions of the book. There's a book that gives you the instructions. It's called the Holy Book, but it's a book. There are also prophets who are supposed to have been given a message from God. In the case of Islam, the Prophet Muhammad. And in other systems in Christianity, prophets. And then there are commandments and laws. And a lot of us try and reduce the 42 confessions of innocence to laws because we're comparing it to Christianity. They're not laws. They are, some call them negative confessions, where the deceased spirit passed before 42 netters or divine principles and proclaims, I did not lie, I did not steal, I did not commit adultery. Those are negative confessions, meaning I didn't do negative, right? Those aren't commandments. That's simply saying that you did tell the truth. You did practice morality. And in relationship to a man's wife, never dishonored her or him. So it takes two to tango. It's not rape. They both involved. So, but he never did his part. He didn't, or she didn't, you know? So what's being affirmed underneath that are truths. And they're saying that they had spoke the truth and lived the truth, but for other reasons that I'll get into in a minute. That's a characteristic of a religion, that they need all of these laws. And in Judaism, there's a huge number of laws that the Jews have to follow. You know what I mean? That is their way of keeping them in harness and keeping them in track. So African spirit systems don't have prophets. They don't have commandments. They don't have laws or books, even though in the Yoruba system, they will talk about the Yoruba priest drawing from certain number of books of Ifa. These aren't really books. These are verses that are learned, and these verses are necessary for practicing divination and other parts of the spirit system. But it's not a book that someone is going to for a recipe, you know. They don't have books, oral or written, they're not using them. And that was true in Kemet, writing and oral. And they don't have prophets. And they don't have commandments, and they don't need them. They don't need the commandments, you know, because God's superlative light is manifested in all humans. And so what a human being needs to do right is to commune with their heart and speak and do the truth. So spirit-based civilizations are characterized by spirit being a part of every aspect of life and not restricted to time or space, because when you're dealing with the spirit, they're outside of time and space, as is God. And at the same time, spirit is operating in the realm of time and space and in the physical realm and in possessing spiritual or spirit or physical and material beings. So while in the Kemetic and in African languages in general, there's no word for religion, there is a word for spirit, there is a word for priesthood, there is a word for worship, there is a word for prayer, and African systems place a real heavy thing on sacrifice, something that's foreign to you, most of you. But in African systems, when you're going to say a Babalawo, a priest in the Yoruba system, which means father of mysteries, and you're getting a reading, and the reading says so and so could happen, but to prevent this from happening or to make it or help it happen, you need to make a sacrifice and do so many different things, you know. And so that sacrifice could be a chicken or it could appear to be a chicken. Because after you get the chicken, the reading may say, let it loose. But if it's real serious, what you're dealing with, the chicken will have to be sacrificed. Now, what's the point of that? The point of that is you're giving something in exchange for something because the spirits are going to do something for you. I think I told you before, my Babalawo called me in 1993. I just moved into this house. I was flat broke. I put all my money on the down payment. And my priest calls me and says, I see you in a coffin. He didn't say, when you're 90, he wouldn't have been calling me. And I jokingly said, how'd I look? Because everybody's going to be in a coffin or something. They're going to die. Just like you look now. And I was broke. You got to pay the Babalawo something. And he didn't charge much, but I negotiated a price that was within the range of what I could pay. I was just flat broke. But my life's at stake. If I had to, I'd pay on installments. And you'll say, oh, how do you know you're going to die? I mentioned this before. People in Ghana wanted to initiate me into kingship. I had no interest in that. But some people had made that proposal. And so they went to a diviner to read me, to see who I was. And they said, you shouldn't do it. The man's going to die. And there was nothing wrong with me. Spirits were going to take me out. And so when he did his thing, he came to the housewarming, this new house, and he wrote in my book, the housewarming book, I have it. He says, you will live a long life. Now, that was 1993, and I was in my 50s, and I'm 82 going on 83. Now, you could say, how do you know you're going to die? So I'm supposed to wait around and see if I'm going to die. I know this system's accurate. I know that Ifeyemi has always, who's my Babalawo, has always been accurate in his readings. And so I know that I'm just lucky to have had him around so that he could tell me this, because I had no indication there was anything wrong with me, because there was nothing wrong with me. Some spirit had decided to take me out. And you can say spirits can't take you out. Well, there are autopsies performed on some people who are pretty young who die, and ain't no indication of what caused the death. And that doesn't mean a spirit took them out, but it also doesn't mean that a disease took them out either. You know, so what took them out? So in spirit systems, you have words for spirit, priesthood, worship, prayer, and sacrifice. These are all common words and common practices. But here's the key thing, and this unites both African American, African Caribbean, South American, Africans in the diaspora, wherever you are. Listen to this one. There is a word, and it is the highest form of prayer. And so what do you think that is? Praise. You hear me? Praise. Black Christians who do praise, most don't know. That's African worship. You hear me? When the Kemites would revere a netter, a divine principle, and I'll go into this in a minute, but they would bring a statue that has real power. I'll explain this in a minute, how that power is achieved, into the community. And that represents a netter, a sar, a set, a ru, whatever, representing different principles of nature and of life, death, and rebirth. Everyone wanted to be reborn and go to heaven. You got to live a life Maat to do that. And so they would bring this out, and this would be in the village, and for praise. And how would they do that? The same way we did it here, the same way the Yoruba did it, the same way the Asante did it, the same way the Bambara did it. You hear me? Through drumming, through rattling things, through singing, through dancing, and through praise worship. Praise the Lord. What happens in a black church? And so you'll find some small piece in the Bible where they'll talk about praise the Lord, and they think, well, that's come from. No, that came from your African spiritness. You hear me? Why? Because when the African is engaging in praise worship and making all these beautiful sounds, it is for the purpose of attracting the spirit and bringing the spirit down to possess you. You hear me? So the wisdom and power of God can be inside of you. And of course, that's central to voodoo and other things. And when the African in America, and I'm going to get into this when I get into the African American, I've been touching on the African American component. I'm going to get into it in a minute on the African American component. But when we come out of enslavement, and there's an effort to get us to walk into the white way of worship, Blacks were adamant that they would praise the Lord, because as many Southern Blacks would say, because if we don't, the spirit, they would say, the spirit would not come down. That goes to another subject, though. Were Blacks Christians during slavery? And if so, what kind? Was it really Christianity? Really? That's a whole other story. I'll get into a little bit of it later. So the point is, praise worship is key to the spirit tradition because it is the form that brings down the spirit. And that practice was carried into the Western Hemisphere wherever we went in the enslavement process or however we got to this new world. If we came here, for example, the Olmecs, Ivan Van Sertima didn't point this out in his book, which is the major work on the Olmecs in America. They came before Columbus, but in other works, it's been pointed out that one of the things that the Africans carried to Mesoamerica, as a mother civilization of the Olmecs, was the priesthood and sacrifice. And again, sacrifice for what? To bring down the spirit. And so Mayan, Aztec, Toltec, and Inca, they received that from this African spirit-based culture. And we know that Native American civilizations, whether Mesoamerican or North American, are spirit-based in a profound way that gives them great dignity and great beauty, so praise worship is the highest form of worship. And it's one of the reasons the Black church is different from the white church. It's full of drama, baby. You know what I mean? Yes, indeed. Dramatic to the extreme. That's an expression of the hieroglyphic mentality, something I'm not getting into today, So In Kemet, spirit was a part of every part of life. Now, when I explain some of this, it's going to be strange to you because we've been so miseducated in this Western system. And here, even though we may know the history of Kemet or something else, the stuff I'm giving you, mostly when you talk about Kemetic civilization, the spirit basis isn't included, other than in a general way, God. They talk about netters. But generally, how it manifests in every way of life is generally not discussed because if you are highly miseducated, which is highly educated, this is superstition. And this is some stuff you just don't need to discuss. You know what I mean? So here's how this worked. In the West, a painting, for example, is called art, and generally it performs the role of beautification or what they call beauty. Now I see some of this American art, they can take a can of soup and turn it into a painting, or just take one color and put it on a screen and paint it red. And I've been looking at some of this stuff. People going into a museum, sitting down and looking at red. What the holy hell are you looking at? You know what I mean? Huh? Some Chinese paint their houses red, because red's a favorite color for them, and you could call that beautification if that's what you like. You know what I mean? My Corvette is red. I drive a Corvette, by the way. And don't be telling me that ain't revolutionary. It gives this revolutionary satisfaction. You hear me? I've been driving a Corvette. I've been driving a sports car since I learned what I liked. And it got nothing to do with being young. I've explained this before because I started driving a sports car, TR6, when I was 32 or 33. It's because it's what I like. You know what I mean? And it's red. You know what I mean? It's red, But the point is, in the West, it's art for art's sake. Or if it's abstract art, it means whatever the painter meant. And very often he's just slopping colors together. And sometimes it looks pretty good too. I have to admit, some of this stuff looks pretty good. And some of it looks like a straight up mess. And then a lot of stuff got no symmetry, no balance, no nothing. And they call that beautiful. You know what I mean? But the key point is Africans didn't really call this art, and yet it was very beautiful. The paintings, for example. And so the paintings that are in the tombs, these are for the purpose of performing rituals and stuff that help guide the soul to the afterlife. It's serving a ritual and spiritual purpose. And by the way, this is a gift from the Twa, because if you look at Twa rock art, it's symbolic. Some of it, if you look at my book, The Integration Trap, I actually have some pictures of Set, for example, the brother of Asar, which is portrayed in Twa rock art, But the point is, Twa so-called rock art is magical art. It serves a spirit purpose. In my book, The Integration Trap, and this is recent, I give an example of where some Europeans had been living with the Twa. This was in the 30s or the 40s. And they had run out of meat. So the whites were with the Africans. The whites asked them, could they get some meat? So they said yes, they would go and hunt for an antelope. The white boy went and snuck up and watched them, typical of them, And what happened? This was the night before the hunt that would occur in the morning. And so the Twa man traced a picture of an antelope on the ground. And then the next morning, the Twa woman sang a song just as the sun rose. And then in whatever direction the Chua chose, he could not see the antelope he was shooting. He shot his arrow. And so then after they went to find the game that they knew they had killed, and they couldn't see it when they were shooting the arrow, the white boy went up to see what he had drawn. And he had drawn a picture of an antelope with the arrow in its neck. And when they brought the antelope back, the arrow was in the antelope's neck. And so that picture, when the sister did her chant, when the sun rose, had vibratory power to pull that antelope into the spot where the hunter shot. Now you'll say that ain't true. Yeah, well, you heard about a mojo, baby? Tell me that ain't true. And any of you come from Louisiana where they practice some real voodoo, you know what I mean? Tell me that ain't true. No, what you'll say is, I don't believe it, and you'll run away from it. But that means that you know there's some power there. So the point is, it wasn't art for art's sake. Even though it was beautiful, it served a spirit role. Statues were often carved for specific beings. It could be the statue of a pharaoh, a deceased pharaoh, or a netter, a divine principle. For example, the netter Maat is a divine principle. And so the priest role was to cultivate the statue. This was called the cult. It didn't mean what it means in the West, a cult where you got some blind followers. No, it meant cultivating whatever matter is involved, in this case, a statue, so that the spirit would reside in the statue. Now, some of you who've traveled to Africa should know you should be careful what kind of carvings you get. Is it Taurus carvings? Or are they real carvings that are spirit-based? Because if it's got spirit power, you're bringing a spirit into the house. You better know what kind of spirit that is. And frankly, if you don't know how to manage it, you might be in trouble. It could be a good spirit, but you just might not be able to handle it. Might not be able to handle the energy or whatever else is going down. Science and medicine were a combination of both spirit and specific techniques and methods. For example, they perform surgery. So there's cutting into a person, they examined the whole body and understood anatomy and stuff. And that's a physical component. And this is a thing to really stress about Kemetic systems. Dr. Abenga has pointed this out, that the abstract spirit idea is often combined with something material. So when you're talking about heart-mind, it's conveyed through an actual picture of a heart, because they understood and it had examined every part of the physiology of a human being, But there was a material component to everything that was spiritual. I call this abstract and practical. That's the African system, I have some paintings that I got from Senegal, and these paintings are mask art. And mask art is found all over Africa. It's a part of ceremonial worship where a priest would put on a mask. And it's a part of a ritual ceremony to bring down the spirit. And when you look at this mask art, it's an example of abstract art, but it's very practical. And in this case, it's serving a spirit role, but also it's something that manifests materially. It's a mask, and it's very beautiful. It's not just a bunch of colors all thrown together. And some of those are beautiful. I've seen some that are beautiful. In case you don't get it, I'm into beauty. I think beautiful truth and beauty in general. But beautiful character to me is the most beautiful thing. But beauty, beauty. And the light, the beautiful light, I've seen nothing more beautiful than that, which is God. So science and medicine had a combination of both spirit and technical components. And so a medical operation would be performed while magical utterances are being stated. Now, here's the point about this. You'll say, yeah, what good does that do? Just note this. Western medicine is the only medicine that has no spirit component to it because it's all material. It's all material. Yet if you look at Chinese acupuncture, that it's working on hitting invisible meridians, fields in your body, and it works. You know what I mean? So it's, again, a spirit science. And I'm not saying you don't do surgery. There are times where surgery is necessary, though some surgery doesn't work as good as they say. Check that one out. But if it's needed, do that, But when you combine the two, it's often better. Kemetic science rested on the Nun, N-U-N, which is the primeval watery-like mass that was believed to be the first substance of the world. Now, what's important about this idea is that Kemet is surrounded by water, and 75% or so of the earth is water, and the majority of what constitutes a human being is water. And so they had something here, you know what I mean? But the key point is, what does the water really represent? The electromagnetic force that endows it. And God comes out of this. Their conception of Nun provides one of the better explanations for quantum physics. And it starts the Kemites just as it started the Twa, who had this idea of God being the sum total of all forces, a part of which God distributes to everything that God creates. That's a profound definition of God, or the Bombard conception, God's infinite force outside of space and outside of time, that these are ideas of God that make God a magnificent scientist, as God is a magnificent artist. Look at what God created, And so the first state is a state, the state of Nun, perfectly consistent with the highest realms of science. How heavy do you get? But again, spirit, what is electromagnetic force? It's spirit, it's an energy, as waves and particles are in quantum physics. And all they're concerned about is it's a force, it's an energy. You can work out mathematical equations and use this for power and control. They don't really care. What is the source of this? And that's why quantum physics has reached its dead end, because it doesn't understand its source. And if you understood the source, you'd understand that this isn't just energy to be used for power and control. This is a divine force to be used with great delicacy and not for harm. Whoever invented the atom bomb was straight out of their mind, Once you invent it, everybody else is going to, and then you're in a situation where no one in their right mind uses it. They used it on the Japanese because they didn't have it. But any people that has it, they ain't using it. You hear me? They can talk all this talk about Russia all you want. What Russia is doing in Ukraine is wrong. But either side pulled the trigger, then it's all over for both sides. That's why they call it MAD, mutually assured destruction. Who in the hell creates a defense system based on insanity? Someone who's insanely attracted to power. You hear me? So the tie of spirit and science was so close that a physician was also a priest. An astrophysicist was also a priest. Think of that. Imhotep that you saw on the leaflet here. Builder of the first step pyramid, multi-genius, father of medicine, ran the whole country, was prime minister. He was both a priest, a prime minister, an architect. And architects knew astrophysics because they aligned their structures with eternity, with the stars. How bad is that? And they built it of substance that would last, if not forever, for a long time. And some mumbo jumbo's coming on the internet now saying that the pyramids were built with concrete. Give me a break. I've been to the pyramids. I was in Khufu's pyramid. I sat in the burial chamber of Khufu. His body's been taken out. And that's stone, baby. Stone. Concrete cracks. Japanese engineers didn't go to the pyramids to figure out how it was built because it was built out of concrete. You hear me? Huh. Give me a break. Give me a break. And no one knows how they were built. And I'm not going to tell you they were built through levitation. I'm talking spirit. It wasn't built through no levitation. Please believe me. They had some techniques for that. We just don't know what they were. I've heard some explanation. Herodotus provides some, for example. Now, so are you getting the point? Spirit is in everything. Now, understand that the spirit in medicine or the spirit in art or the spirit in whatever, it had both a spirit and a material component, but it was spirit guiding it. So these were not people just hanging in the air, but they were being guided by divine forces. Now, astronomy. Of course, I've already pointed out the Kemites gave birth to astrology, and I've gone through that. You read Herodotus, he'll tell you. But in the case of astronomy, we know that the pyramids were built as astronomical observatories. And they, as astronomical observatories, served the purpose of observing the motions of planets and stars. For what purpose? Spirit, baby. Get this straight. For the purpose of determining the proper time for performing spirit rites and rituals, which were planetary and stellar ceremonies designed to draw down planetary and stellar spirit energy, usually in the form of worshiping netters associated with it. Orion, which is the major star that the pyramids were aligned towards at different periods in its cycle, is at the beginning of our stellar system. And that's named after Osiris in the Western system, because he's at the beginning of your civilization. Think about that. I've mentioned this before. Some of you haven't seen the show, haven't heard this. Map making. Now, what's more material than map making? You got to do something to examine the earth to be able to set up maps and measure it. You got to be able to do that. You know what I mean? And know its shape. The Kemites had no funny idea about the earth being flat and all the rest of the stuff that the Westerners had. But the basis for map making originated out of the Kemetic spirit mind. It was for the purpose of exploring, listen to this, the realm of heaven. And this was so that spirits who were passing to the next life would know the proper route to heaven. So this is telling you that there's a material component to the spirit. You know what I mean? In other words, there's a geography for heaven. What you think of that? And of course, you couldn't follow this path unless you practice Maat, because you going to another place. Otherwise, I know some people say there ain't no hell. I know there ain't no devil. There is a place that resembles hell. Parapsychologists confirm it. It's hot. It's a mess. You don't want to be there. You hear me? You do not want to be there. But God rules it, not no devil. You hear me? The devil's on the earth. And even then, there's really no devil because it means all bad. Nothing's all bad or all good on earth. Some may be close to all good, but none are all good on earth. Only God, you know? So think about that. Your geography was inspired by the geography of spirit land, heaven. Language. Swearing is an abomination in African speech. It's an abomination. Why? And a lot of the capping that Black people do on your mama, you know, the M, you know what? As a kid, I never did that. I ain't no saint. I'm not no Jeremiah. I'm not putting myself on nothing. But I have this. I respect my mama. And I'm not saying anything about anybody else's mama, not because I don't want you to say anything about mine. It's just that my mother is special to me, like I know your mother is to you. But you better not be saying anything about my mother. You better not. You hear me? Same thing with girlfriends, you know? Be sitting up with all these brothers talking about, oh, they did this and they did that. I ain't saying nothing. Why? That's private. You don't put your private business in public. They didn't even know who my girlfriend was. It's none of your business. That's my private life. You hear me? So that's a desecration right there. And then all this cursing that we got to do all the time. My wife's never heard me curse. I'm a warrior. So I have to admit that when I'm in battle, driving terror into my enemies, no telling what's going to happen. You know what I mean? But I don't curse them. That's a thing I don't do because I treat my enemies with respect because they're going to be eaten out of my hands when I beat them. But that ain't why. It's my nature. My nature is honor. And so as a warrior, treat my opponents with honor. I don't care how dishonorable they are. I'm not going down to their level. I'm just out to whip them. So that's my code as a warrior, you know? But the key thing is that if you look at the language of Kemet, the language of Africa, these languages all have a divine source, a spirit foundation. So in Kemet, it's Medu Neter, the speech of God. Medu Nefer, Medunetcher, Medu Neter, the speech of God. Human speech was designed to approximate God's speech, Medu Nefer. The Bambara have the same idea. Divine speech and sacred speech. Divine speech comes from God. Sacred speech is a speech that comes from the first ancestor who was closest to God, that human beings then try to approximate. And for humanity, that's the Twa. For each ethnic group, that's their first ancestor. For Kemites, that's a Sar, you know. And for other ethnic groups, whoever that first ancestor was, because they received wisdom from the source. And that also means they were people, Ma in Bambara, Jeremiah in Kemet, self-mastered people. So speech was spirit-based. And check this one out. I've discussed this before, but you ain't getting this in any books. The source of the power of speech was its vibratory force, the energy that it conveys, and that is only conveyed through truth. When you think truth, speak and do truth, that's when your speech has power. And you usually know when you're in the presence of that, because Black people are a I feel you person or people. I mean, I can feel you. And when things are off, they can usually feel that. And women, Black women are probably better at this than men because they're more open to those feelings, though Black men are too. Because in African systems, there's no distinction when it comes to being attuned to the spirit between masculine and feminine. In the West, there is, because of the way in which the male has shut themselves off from sensitivity, caring, kindness, and higher truths. So African philosophy is characterized by being attuned to spirit, whereas European philosophy is despiritualized. It's, in fact, they're proud of not having any connection to anything spirit-based, spiritual, or religious in many cases, but definitely not spirit-based. And so, again, at the foundation of Kemetic philosophy is what? Maat. Maat is the foundation, and Maat is the ultimate force of spirit in the cosmos, along with God, that it is a manifestation of. So I hope I made my case that the Twa most important legacy to humanity is spirit. And the top of Kemetic civilization is spirit. And now, my favorite subject, you new Africans are African Americans. And I'm not leaving out the Caribbean or South America or Africans in Europe. I got to focus on one. But all the others have this power as well. But we also have some distinct qualities arising from the unique position that we maintain. So this subject is God's superlative light in Egyptian and African American civilization. This is the African American, or new African, as I call it, civilizational component. We all know we didn't come here on the Mayflower. We didn't come here on no Mayflower. They dropped us into ships, one of which was called the good ship Jesus. Now, how good was that? Good for what? In my mind, good for nothing. And it was on the good ship Jesus, chartered by John Hawkins and others, in which our ancestors were packed like sardines. But it was on these ships, that's the beginning of it, where we carried the spirits of Africa. So the spirits were inside of us, and this was key to our ability to resist and to be the people we are today. And the spirit was in our presence. Zora Neale Hurston, the mighty sister, whose best book was Mules and Men, which is a book that covers voodoo, especially African-American voodoo and other spirit practices. She talks about how on the slave ships was carried the spirits of Africa, one of the most important of which was High John the Conqueror, who in the blues is called High John the Conqueror. Now, the blues man doesn't know the history of the origin of this. In most cases, some do, most don't. So in the blues, High John the Conqueror is a magical potion. And it is used to get you a woman or a man, And the best place to get it would be in New Orleans, where this Voodoo is practiced most fully because it was a Catholic country. And so this was a very important force that we carried with us. He was in the air, he was in the spirits as we were packed together on these slave ships. High John the Conqueror was representative of the warrior spirit, the fighting spirit. If mothers wanted to really keep a child in line, African mothers, enslaved African mothers, they would tell them High John the Conqueror is coming. Now, High John the Conqueror wasn't there to really terrorize Africans, but he was such a strong force for fighting for what was right that could also be used to keep a child behaving right. But the key point about High John the Conqueror was that he was African courage and African bravery. And many of the slave narratives, when enslaved Africans who had been in the U.S. for maybe a couple of generations or longer, came into contact with new Africans brought over, what they call saltwater Africans. This is one of the first things they would say about him. Endowed with African bravery. That's the first thing they would say. Now, High John the Conqueror was manifested in the form of Cinque, C-I-N-Q-U-E, who led the slave revolt called the Amistad, A-M-I-S-T-A-D, rebellion on a slave ship coming to America. He was a member of one of the largest secret societies of Africa called the Poro Society, coming out of Sierra Leone and West Africa. And these are warrior societies. And they were fighting the Europeans who were engaged in the slave trade. He was captured as a warrior. He was one who was a prisoner of war, because there were two types: those captured in various means and those who were captured in battle. Those came in with the fighting spirit, but those who were not captured in battle came in with the fighting spirit as well. And so Cinque's warrior tradition was one where the favored weapon was a machete. Slicing somebody's throat was like one of the favored methods for taking out an opponent. And so when a child on the board, an African child on the board of the Amistad ship comes below, because they were allowed to move on the deck, they said, there's a whole barrel full of machetes. And then on board the ship were blacksmiths. And so they could break any lock in a minute, you know. And so at the appropriate time, they broke the lock, got up on the ship, and got them some machetes and began to slice their way to freedom. And you know the story. They went on trial and were ultimately freed. But the point is, that was High John the Conqueror, manifested in the form of Cinque, manifested in the form of Harriet Tubman, manifested in the form of Denmark Vesey, Nat Turner, and a whole Gabriel Prosser, and a whole lot of others. And in the Caribbean, manifested in the form of Antonio Maceo, who led the Cuban Revolution in the 19th century and was on the verge of freeing the island when America intervened, Teddy Roosevelt and his crap, you know, because they didn't want another black island run by black people like Haiti, you know. And so I was in Cuba in 83, 84, representing the National Black United Front and negotiating some stuff with the Cuban government. And I actually have a picture here of Antonio Maceo, of him in battle. When Fidel Castro leads his rebellion, he's following pretty much the pattern of Antonio Maceo. So Africans brought this fierce spirit tradition of resistance. There's a common assumption that the African was docile and submissive and all the rest of this stuff. And of course, there's this common myth of Willie Lynch that Professor Manu Ampin that's been on talking about Martin Luther King dispelled through a book on Willie Lynch, that there was a Willie Lynch. First of all, wouldn't it be funny that the person that led the brainwashing, as though there was one and there wasn't, would have the last name Lynch? Now, there are white people that have, and some black people have the last name Lynch, but which they got from white people. But what's the likelihood of that? I'm a historian. I knew that was plain bull. You know what I mean? Plain bull. Yeah, you can, but blacks have an investment in their victimization to the point that they got to invent one. Even when it was proven that there was no Willie Lynch, they turn around talking about, yeah, but they did that to us. Yeah, they tried to pit blacks based on color. You know what I mean? On occupation, house and field, you know. And of course, they did their brainwashing. They tried. And to some extent, for some, they succeeded. But the fact is, there was a war on the plantation from day one. And those of our people running around here with this Willie Lynch stuff that hasn't cracked a book on African or African American history don't know what the hell they're talking about. Because from day one, the African coming into the Americas, including the United States, did not fit the type that could be subject to being broken in. They tried to, but it didn't work. As the Africans who were in Suriname, who were some of the fiercest fighters the Europeans ever faced, that was a Dutch colony. One of the Dutch generals who had been fighting African warriors said, and they would capture an African in battle and put them on a rack and break every bone in their body. And they said, these Africans can't be broken. It is very hard to break a human being. And even those who were at the point of breaking could often revive themselves, like Frederick Douglass, who saw his spirit nearly knocked out of him, his spirit of feeling alive, his spirit of having any sense of being human. But then what did it take? Throwing one punch against COVID and having a little bit of Africa, one of those magic charms that was given to him by an old, I've discussed this in a previous show, by an old wise elder on the plantation. And he told him, ever since I had this, no white man's ever laid his hands on me. And so that proved to be just about true, because Frederick Douglass for 2 hours whipped Covey and didn't suffer anything from it, because Covey didn't want to admit he was beaten by an enslaved African. But here's the point. The average African coming into America had this same fighting, High John the Conqueror spirit. First of all, they were between the ages of 18 and 30. Possessed with African courage. These were Africans who resented the idea that any human being could own them. They came from societies where freedom was like running water. It was like the oceans. You hear me? It was like the sunrise. It was just as natural as breathing, you know? So to be restricted and contained like this is something they resented to their souls. And they viewed slavery as a temporary situation that they would overcome. And that would be true of successive generations of Africans descended from them. They also would believe that. Why? Because the Spirit of God that dwelled within them told them, sometimes while they were planting cotton, that a day will come where this will end. And some of them could even see how. You hear me? So they viewed enslavement as something that could be overcome. And they had the idea of resistance. So if the bastards said one thing, the enslaved did the other, and at a great peril. So if they said, don't meet beyond 2 people, meet together, they'd meet in groups at night. And they meet for many reasons: to plot and plan, to give encouragement to each other, to fry them some chicken that they had managed to pull out of the master's barnyard, and to put their heads under a pot to pull down the spirit called the hush harbor, the spirit, so that it could sustain them. And by the way, that was the basic reason for the hush harbor, is the basic reason for the Black Turk, to carry you on from day to day, because you're in an oppressive situation. But to be in a position where the spirit could talk to you, could give you direction and give you inspiration, the hush harbor. You hear me? For the African who comes to the Americas, including the United States, the spirit was a 24-hour or 24/7 experience, 24-hour a day, 7-day experience. So their experience was not confined to a Sunday thing, and most of them were not Christians. So it was the experience of the spirit that was everywhere, that enabled, more than anything, there were other reasons: the love of family, even when you're separated from family, that extended family, your close friends, a host of other things. There were other reasons that sustained us over this terrible midnight of enslavement. But spirit was at the top of the inspiration list. It enabled Africans to resist. It enabled Africans to endure. It enabled Africans to keep their sense of humanity, their sense of kindness together. It was a common observation of outsiders on the plantation that the enslaved African carried the qualities of nobility. They carried, the qualities of kindness. They carried the qualities of sharing. They carried the qualities of soul. They carried the qualities of love. And they carried the qualities of the artists. You hear me? These were the qualities that arises from the art, the light within. And I want to point out that the qualities of the nobility, in part, you could say, in the case of Kemet, Yoruba, Sante, those, the kingly system. So in that sense, nobility. And so there's an aristocratic quality of the enslaved African. And it's Zora Neale Hurston, again, who made the observation that the closer you were to slavery, the more African you were, and I would add, the more noble and proud you were, contrary to this brainwashing stuff. And there was brainwashing, so don't get me wrong. But we didn't succumb to it, largely. We created a culture that provided an immunity. Yeah, we had some issues. They come us out of slavery. I'm not denying it. But this Black consciousness, this love of your people, enabled us to transcend that. Something that those who argue the pure victim thing, they took our culture from us. No, in the midnight of slavery, you recreated a culture on the foundations of African principles and new African ones, the new African ones being race consciousness and Pan-Africanism. That second one is the one that provided the fuel for giving Africa a concept of uniting against imperialism, against colonialism. It was the African in the US and the Caribbean, as I pointed out before, especially Trinidad, that contributed that idea, arising out of a bunch of spirit traditions, particularly Ethiopianism, the idea that princes shall come out of Egypt, Ethiopia shall stretch forth its hand unto God. That was really the source, that spirit belief of Pan-Africanism. So even the idea of unity, African unity, had a spirit foundation. So this idea that the African and American, a lot of nationalists have picked this idea up. A lot of them believe that we got tricked into Christianity during slavery. We got brainwashed, you know what I mean? And then they look down on the Black church and talk about how messed up it is. And there's some mess in the Black church. But there's also some strengths in the Black church. And the Black church is the one institution Black people own. You understand? King came out of the Black church. He didn't have all the support of a lot of preachers, but he had him a core. But the key point is, it is a myth that Blacks embraced Christianity during enslavement. Why would we? Let's just use common sense. I'm going to give facts in a minute, but let's just use some common sense, first of all. Why would a people who are already endowed with all the qualities of spirit even need something called religion when it went contrary to their orientation? For example, white religion is characterized by being doctrinal. They got a whole series of doctrines you're supposed to follow. And then in the Western world, divided up according to Protestantism and Catholicism and leading to wars of religion. And we didn't have those ideas. I mean, what? So we weren't into doctrine. We're into spirit. You hear me? So that's the first thing. But we come out of a system where to know something, you have to be it. And so if you're supposed to be a knowing Christian, you got to be Christ-like. What slave master was Christ-like? Some enslaved would distinguish between a good master and a bad master, but they were all bad because they all enslaved you. Some of them with a smile, most of them with a whip. Either way, no good. And the most savage of slave masters, according to the enslaved Africans, were the Christian ones, the most dedicated ones. You hear me? And if you had any light up on whippings and stuff, it might be on Sunday, but that was it. You're going to get it on Monday through Saturday, you know? So why would enslaved Africans embrace a religion based on the Pauline epistles that said, coming from Paul, slave, obey your master? Even the few Blacks who embraced Christianity said, hell no. Older Blacks after slavery, if you said Paul, they would say, shut up. I don't want to hear that mess. Because they said, God opposes slavery. And they're up here, some white preacher up here talking about slave, obey your master. And then they would say, don't steal your master's chickens when you ain't got any meat to eat. Who said steal? How's that stealing? You did all the labor on this place. You hear me? It's yours. If it wasn't given to you, you could liberate it. Liberate you a chicken. You know what I mean? So when the old master who would bring in a white preacher would come in and preach, the enslaved Africans would say, he talks with his mouth, but not from his heart. And they'd say, God didn't say that. The slave master said that. You hear me? So why would they embrace a so-called religion that sanctioned slavery, so-called? So they said, why would they do that? When they believed that God was opposed to slavery and was for freedom. Why would they embrace a religion that was teaching subservience and degradation? Why would they do that when their very spirit taught them to resist enslavement? So as I said before, the motto of the enslaved was inscribed in the favorite spirit song was, before I'll be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave, go home to my Lord and be free. Now, the truth is, the natural leaders of enslaved Africans were spirit men called diviners. and virtually every plantation had one or more of them. Du Bois was accurate in saying that the natural leaders of enslaved Africans were the diviners, or as he called them, obia, men and women. And you have these in the Caribbean as well. Particularly in Protestant countries, they are prevailing. In Catholic countries, you can have voodoo in a stronger form. But these diviners were priests who divined your future. And Du Bois said of them, they were the natural leaders of the masses of enslaved Africans. He said they were the healers of the sick, the comforter of the sorrowful, and they were the rude and natural leaders of the masses of people. Rude meaning, they didn't have the refineries of talking proper English and being submissive to the master. You know what I mean? They were prophets for the people. And of course, there was no prophecy in African systems, but in divination, there is prophecy, baby. Let me tell you, I'm alive because of it. So the proof of the pie is in the pudding. So let me give you a few facts here for those of you who still don't believe that, well, the enslaved Africans were Christians. You know what I mean? Huh? W.B. Du Bois noted, and I note this in my book, The Integration Trap, Generation Gap Caused by a Choice Between Two Cultures. By the way, the most important chapter is nearly 100 pages long on how African-American culture was formed in the United States. This is what Du Bois said. He said that in 1859, and this is towards the end of slavery. So if you had any Christians, then you should have a lot of them by then, from 1619 to 1859. But what does Du Bois say? His research showed that of a Black population then of 8.3 million, only 468,000 were church members in the South. Let me go those numbers again. Out of 8.3 million Blacks, only 468,000 were Black church members in the South in 1859. Now, that's just a few years before the end of enslavement. So, but you're going to say, but yeah, they're Christians. Yeah, really? When Blacks do embrace what they call Christianity, now I'm going to say this, so-called Christianity, they did it at the end of enslavement, and they did it as a group because Blacks had shaped a culture, had formed a culture in enslavement, formed by grassroots Blacks, and that means they had a common mindset. And so they saw the best way to resist enslavement was to have something that you could come under that wouldn't be attacked. Place where you could meet, a place where you could have parties, a place where you could train leaders, and of course, a place where you could worship God. But here's the deal. What they called Christianity was voodoo dropped into what they called Christianity, centered around bringing down the spirit. As I pointed out earlier, when white missionaries and Black missionaries, many coming from the AME church, came down to the South, the end of enslavement, their job was to whitenize Black religious or spiritual worship. And they refused on many counts, one of which was they refused to give up praise worship. And they refused to give up a whole lot of other things that were a part of the culture of African people that even whites called voodoo. And it's still in the Black church. It's still in the Black church. And that's why the Black church is different from the white church, both spiritually and politically. Politically, the African would pick the church form that would give them the maximum say-so in running the church. And so while the AME church was the first church to be formed, one of the first churches to be formed by Blacks, It's a top-down church where the top picks the preachers. But coming out of a Troy and then classless age grade societies where democracies through consensus, the African grassroots who made the decision to take on Christianity on their own terms, they adopted that form that gave them the greatest say-so, and that tended to be Baptists and Methodists. I pointed this out before. I'm the only scholar that has this information. Du Bois had the intuition, and he was right. His intuition was that the Obeah men and women, the diviners, were the first leaders in the Black church. He didn't have any proof for it. I have the proof. I do proof. I'm a spirit man, but I believe in facts, baby. Show me the facts. Where's the beef or the vegetables if you're a vegetarian, or if you're both, you need them all. And the fruit, where is it? You know what I mean? So my research clearly shows that many, not all, but many of the first preachers that made up the Black church were diviners. Why would they be the first preachers? Because they had the greatest spirit power. They were the natural leaders coming out of enslavement. They were the people endowed with wisdom, great wisdom. And they had been the people who, because one of the roles of a diviner in enslavement was to prevent a whipping through various means. That's what all the enslaved said. So anytime you see all the former slaves saying the same thing, they're telling you a truth, but they're also hiding the real reason or real reasons. Yes, they were going for that, but they were really going for their future, finding out what the future had for them. You say, what future does a slave have? Well, that's your mentality. It wasn't theirs. And if they had a plot that they were carrying out, like insurrection or something, they wanted to see what the chances of success was, the spirit that the Twa passed on to Africa was carried in the souls of Black folks. The enslaved African in the United States created a new African culture and a new African art form. Now, the Euro-American, I pointed this out before, the Euro-American has no art form nor culture indigenous to this country. They're both imports from Europe. There's a group called the Council on Humanities, and in the 60s, you had Europeans coming to the US talking about American culture. And so they were asking the whites, so in your culture, what's your art form? And so they were citing classical music. They said, no, that comes from us, from Europe. What have you evolved here? They have evolved no art form because they have not evolved a culture suited to America. The African in America was forced to rearrange African culture when it was attacked and they tried to wipe it out. And so as a result, it's a new African culture art form, but founded on fundamental principles of African culture, of which spirit, family, humanism, democracy, freedom are key. And there are many others, with some new assertions. And of course, the brainwashing in between. I don't deny that, But the fact is that we could create both a culture and an art form under the fire of oppression. That's nearly comparable to what the Haitians achieved in producing freedom under enslavement. That's the greatest achievement. And I bow my hat to the Haitians as being number one in the Western Hemisphere when it comes to culture and everything else. Because in the history of the world, no other people have been able to break the back of slavery. And they did. And they've been paying a price for it ever since. And we should be doing everything we can to mobilize behind them, to give them support so that they can get the monkeys off their back. And these monkeys are all white, you know. So the African in America has created both a culture and an art form. And I call this New African. And this culture is, and this art form, they both are the popular cultures and art forms of the world. The Euro-American could not create a culture, did not create a culture here, and could not create an art form, because if you haven't created a culture indigenous to the place in which you live, you can't create an art form. Of course, it's going to be an import, just like the culture was, and it's going to be an oppressive import, one that's going to have to undergo a displacement as the numbers change in this country. Now, the spiritual blues are both the highest expression and the foundation of the new African art form. And from it was born the blues, jazz, gospel, R&B, soul, funk, and hip hop. And as Dizzy Gillespie said, they all walk side by side. They all have one common source, just as Maat is a common source for the spirit culture of the Kemites and is central to us. They all, in the new African culture, they all have this thing. On one level, this thing is the sound. One expression of it is the moan, which the African in enslavement would say, they moan so the devil wouldn't understand them, and they're referring to white people. But there's beauty in the moan. We would take things that could represent pain and turn them into beauty. But this thing that Dizzy Gillespie said only certain jazz singers had and others didn't have, and only certain singers have, Black singers have, and they're generally those that come out of the spiritual blues, and I call the spirituals blues because I explained before, they're more about the trials and tribulations of everyday life. Because again, it's a spirit-based system. They're not religious music. And most of the spirituals don't sing about Jesus because most Blacks at that time were not Christians. You know what I mean? But they sing about life. And generally, the spiritual blues is a music of freedom, coded and symbolic, whereas gospel blues is drawing from the same sound, but now it doesn't, or at least Blacks thought they didn't need to code it, when in fact they do, because the codes were designed to conceal intention. So steal away, the white boy thought it meant stealing away to heaven. It meant stealing away from this plantation. Or give me this road, you can give me this road and you can have Jesus. In other words, you can have this in America. Give me the good ship Jesus that I came here on. So this sound, this thing is a mixed sound, joy and sorrow, sadness and ecstasy, all blended together. That's the blues sound, the blues sound. And it is that sound that is of great beauty, and it is that sound that really summarizes the ethos of the African in America. Whereas the ethos of the African in Kemet is Maat, the ethos of the African in America, I've said this before, is creativity. Because out of the necessity of how we created this culture, then it called for the greatest creative resources possible. Only the Twa manifested greater creative resources. And so the mantra of the African in America is not to do the same thing the same way twice. The mantra of the African in America is not to be somebody else, to be yourself. The mantra of George Washington Carver, who was the Imhotep of Black science of the 20th century, was to be himself. That's what he said. He wanted to be himself. He said, you can't teach anybody anything. Just bring out what's already there. That's the basis for the book I'm finishing. You know what I mean? George Washington Carver. A magnificent manifestation of creativity. And you can say of this African in the United States, the ethos of creativity makes you the most creative Africans or people on the planet. And it's from this spirit connection that is at the heart of this that you have the answers that you don't even know what they are. I don't either, all of them, for providing the keys for your own liberation, but the liberation of humanity. So, just as Asar was able to go throughout the world and spread civilization without an army, the Chwa were able to do the same thing. So the African Americans' culture and art form, because we often confuse art form with culture. We just talk about the music and stuff. But it's the culture manifested by the political thought of Martin Luther King or Malcolm X. The culture manifested in the way of life and design for living of Africans in America that's an outgrowth of Africa with new additions that manifest in the cause of freedom. And it's this culture that inspires Africans and people all over the world to stand up for freedom. And so, just as Asar and just as the Chwa were able to bring civilization to the world without an army, we've been able to do the same thing. This culture of popular choice, this art form of popular choice, has conquered the hearts of the world without firing a single shot. You hear me? So I want to say God's superlative light that lit up Egypt or Kemet and the African in America is a light that's going to help liberate us and humanity. Make the crooked straight and the unjust just. Hotep. Hope you got something out of that. Let's go to this, the comments here. See if there's any questions here. Worley Smith, Antonio Maceo, the Bronze Titans of Cuba's Struggle for Independence by Philip Boner. Very good. Yeah, I haven't read that. I'll make a point of reading it. So let's see what we have here. How could the African in America use Maatan civilization principles to build our mentalities after the hell we have faced in this country? What are you talking about? It's inherent in us. Basically, if you look at the African in enslavement, what did we do? We took care of each other when no one else did. That's Maat. When we're coming out of slavery, we took in children who had been separated from their parents, as we did in enslavement. We did that. It's basic to the African American. It's basic to all African people. So we're already doing it. You know what I mean? Kindness is key to our culture, even though all of us ain't kind. LaShonda Henderson, how you doing, LaShonda? Western medicine still relies on the spirituality of the person. The placebo appeals as proof. They won't say it out loud, but what the person believes matters in healing. Yeah, but it's demonstrating the power of mind over matter. but it's not really bringing in spirit as a way of healing. It's just showing you that if you believe something, well, maybe that can happen. But Western medicine doesn't have methods built into it for spirit healing. "1720 is from London. Thank you for caring enough for us and our collective future to share your knowledge, Baba, from London, UK, with loving gratitude." Thank you. And I appreciate the number of brothers and sisters from Britain who watch this show, as well as different parts of the world. Lashonda Henderson. So does that mean Asar has some impact on Hinduism? Maybe. The original people who are called Hindu today are the Dravidians. And they were the people who were the founders of the civilization. But when you have the Aryans coming in and conquering, then they mix their stuff up with the African stuff. So you have to be very careful of dissecting one from the other. Okay. It would appear. Let me see if there's any questions on the bottom. Oh, Norman Brown. Brother woke me up. Thanks, Norman. Okay, that appears to be it. Today's presentation was more than just summarizing what I've covered before. Today's presentation was showing you how this light is central to the development of civilization, and therefore central to all African civilizations, in this case, Kemetic and African American. So this is focusing on a different component. I'm summarizing some stuff to get you to that, but these are different. And I have not covered the way in which spirit has affected every component of Kemetic civilization. But the key point is it's that light that's the source of the power. Worley Smith, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, my whole point is to share stuff with people so that they can use it in their own lives and empowering people further to produce change in yourself, but in society. That's my whole purpose in this. And I encourage people who are watching the show that haven't to sign up for the show, and also make a donation. You've got a donation under there because these changes we make cost something, and I can't continue to finance this just on my own. So I'm not doing this for money, but I need some help. So, and Robin, I thank you for your dedication, and Brother Ugawa, and all of you for your interest. I really appreciate it. So, Hotep, until next week.